turned into a really prolific writer. And I'm more familiar with his earlier work, like his short stories and memoirs and novellas, but environmental activism. But I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at this work here, which was published in 2018. And at this point in his life, Rick Bass is in his mid-50s, and something compels him to leave his valley and hit the road and visit the homes of his heroes, who are writers of an older generation. And the goal is for him to cook a meal for them in their kitchen with some food that he brings along, like wild game and things like that. And he also brings along a writing student and sort of acts as a bridge between the two generations. He starts on his journey by visiting Peter Matthiessen here, who is, of course, famous for his own journey with all of this Eastern spirituality mixed in. But Peter Matthiessen didn't always leave that much space for you to figure things out on your own. He just kind of sucked the air out from all around you with this anal, austere style that he had. But it was those moments when you caught whiffs of something else, some very un-Zen-like things, and those were the times when you felt like you caught this glimpse of a more interesting and rare animal. At the end of his visit, Peter Matthiessen shows Rick Bass his own personal meditation chamber, which is kind of like this concept of a writer's studio where you can go and obliterate the world and just get high on your own words. And if you're lucky, just leave the world altogether permanently with pen in hand. Amy Hempel, in the cemetery where Al Jolson is buried, this is a story that Rick Bass would just worship. And you think that they were close buddies over the last 20 years, but they only met face to face one time. I don't really see how it's possible to get past like all the small talk in these brief encounters and get to the deeper stuff that Rick was hunting for. Right after visiting Amy, tried to visit his old editor, Gordon Lish, who wasn't available at all. And come to find out, Amy was actually married to Gordon Lish, which is complete news to me. I always kind of thought that she was something of a side chick or someone that was hinted at in some of his work. But, you know, Gordon Lish always practices sort of false autofiction that made you question reality. And you can tell that that was what he was getting off on all along. Another writer here that Rick Bass visits, Denis Johnson. They actually live not too far away from each other, but they had just never gotten around to meeting. And at this point in Denis Johnson's life, he'd already gone through rock bottom, and he was being uplifted by his spouse, who said that all she really wanted to do was to help him write. And you can see that with certain writers like John Updike, at least with his second wife, or Robert Stone, or Nabokov, or especially V.S. Nepal, like these long-suffering spouses that without whom the authors would have crumbled apart. Some other writers you figure he would have visited would be Barry Hannah, if he was alive. Figure he would have visited Larry Brown, who also passed away even younger. This book, it's a super comfy short story collection, which, if I recall, is mostly about drinking beer and trying to get published. Just sending these stories out and getting rejection after rejection. But it was encouraging to see others go through the same struggles, just barely able to sit through an office job, just wanting to flee to the wilderness on the weekends, and finally fleeing for good all the way to northwest Montana near the Canadian border. Not only that, but also taking along the girl of your dreams. His first short story appeared here in the Paris Review in 1987, and this is a story that he would later expand into his first novel. And the young editor at the Paris Review at the time said that the story had reminded him of the work of Jim Harrison. He's always writing these kind of like nature-based magic realist stories almost, but it was the title novella which rubbed me the wrong way for so many years because it just seemed out of place. It was like this imagining of the girl of his dreams, basically, just getting up and leaving, and one day leaving for good, like permanently, and just envisioning what his life would be like afterward. Yeah, it was hard living, but they always seemed to make it through, the nature just wrapping them up in this magical spell in this valley that was always on the verge of destruction by greedy corporations, where half the time he'd spend campaigning for the preservation of the Yak Valley, which he describes so well here in the Book of Yak. His early raw style got smoothed out over time into something that was handcrafted and polished and super comfy, but He'd never shy away from those awkward scenes, like this one chapter where he visits David Sedaris in the UK. This is a man that is living a totally different kind of fairy tale life. What's interesting about David Sedaris is that he confessed to Rick Bass that he had this anxiety about his writing being just product, and that one day his shelf life would expire and everything would evaporate. All these covers were done by American painter Russell Chatham, who is another person that Rick Bass goes and visits. And what was notable about that visit was that Russell was very close still with one of his ex-wives, and that they would talk on the phone almost every single day. This kind of closeness that happened back when words just powered through like this electric current, which made up for the lack of electricity literally in his writing studio. But what happens when the creation later is done more out of desperation as a last thread to hold on to?
All the love I have here, sometimes it's just not enough. Get you in the sum of I fall.
And I see a lot of times in the, if you want to call it that, in the artistic community, like in this little town, you know, people whose heroes are not strong. You know, they select somebody at random to be their hero who's not a powerful, strong person. And so they're kind of negatively impacting themselves by doing that.
Sitting in your word studio / death chamber as a way of distracting yourself, as she slips away and goes off on her own, just trying to find some way to see things more clearly, just make everything more tolerable, while you go from book to book, each one being a paragraph in a larger work where sometimes if you blur your vision, you can catch a glimpse of her shape again, her touch reaching out and grabbing a hold. After a certain point, it's like I finally understood that title novella. It's about letting things go, even though deep down, I just want them to be back together again.
Bring her back to light, never looking back.